Okay, uh, taking a chuck steak, and as I mentioned before, it's one of the cheaper cuts. Okay, so we're gonna make the best out of it that we can. Um, Again, following the lines of fat, I'm gonna split it right down where the line of fat is. Okay. Okay. So we have a piece right here. And then there's another one that looks like a loin steak, and we can cut it straight here and leave that little nub of fat. If the fat's thicker, leave a thicker piece because that's what it looks like. And if you really want to make it prettier, just round out the back end. Okay. Okay. So out of one steak, you get two fairly close looking. Um, Between the two, this one surprisingly doesn't look as nice, but it's going to be more tender than this. Even though this has marbling, this has heavy streaks of fat in it. So this will literally fall apart, whereas this will get a little tough, okay? Anyway, so what do you do when you know it's going to be tough? Okay, there's several ways of dealing with tough cuts, okay? Top round being one of them. Is you can take your slices of meat into convenient slices, and then you can slice it across the grain. Now, as you can see, the meat here is the grain is going this way, okay, up and down. So what you want to do is you want to cut across it, and you can see the striations of meat. And what you want to do is you cut across it, and what will happen is now you see the meat is separating. Okay, whereas if you cut it with the grain, see, it's tough. Okay, but across this way, it's tough too. So if I cut it across the grain. In this case, it separates. You can see the spaces. Okay, so that's one way to do it. You take a tough meat and you cut across the grain and you slice it thin. Now another method, a Chinese method, is to take these thin slices of meat, which you would commonly see in stir fry, and see I'm cutting across the grain, and what you would do is, this is a tenderizing method the Chinese use. A lot of restaurants use it, where you add a little bit of baking powder, and it has a chemical reaction. It acts like a tenderizer. Okay, so you just a little bit, and then what Chinese restaurants, since they know they're going to stir fry it, what they usually do is they add cornstarch, and that coats the meat. You can add your favorite sauce, what have you, and you can add a little water, even a touch of sugar. And what you would do is you would massage the meat either with your hands or I'll use a spoon. Okay, and then you'll find that when you let it sit, the meat will absorb all the sauce. It'll actually dry out. And what you do is you quick stir fry this. I mean quickly, like in 30 seconds, 40 seconds. And you don't let it sit in a pan and just cook it to death, right? You just stir fry it. When you take it out of the pan, a hot pan, and searing the meat, what will happen is when you put it back in a bowl, the hot sauces and the juice will continue to cook it through. And so it will prevent the meat from getting tough by your fast cooking method. And the second method of tenderizing it is with the baking powder. Now you don't want to go overboard on this, because what will happen is if you put too much, you get a metallic taste, and it also bleaches out the flavor of the meat if you use too much of it. So just a little bit, and a little bit goes a long way. Okay. Usually when you use this method, you end up using some kind of sauce that has a lot of flavor in it, and it kind of masks the flavor of the baking powder. Okay, that's one method of tenderizing. Okay, there is a physical method of tenderizing without using chemicals. I'll just put that there. Without using chemicals, and you'll see this in meat plants where they'll take something like a regular steak that's tough. Like this is going to be tough, even though it's got marbling in it. It's going to be tougher than this. Okay, so I want to make this tender. What you can do is they have a device called a mechanical tenderizer, and what it does is I used the old fork and I sharpened it with a grinder, and all this does is it breaks up the meat by puncturing it. Okay, and it cuts through the fibers. Okay, and this is a mechanical tenderizer. Okay, they sell tenderizers on the market that have a handle on it with a lot of blades, and it does that. Okay, typically there's two methods. There's where there's a blade that actually cuts into the meat. Okay, and then the second method is where they actually have small knives that actually cut into the meat this way. You'd see that on a cube steak. So that's a very, very tough piece of meat that they have these little knives serrate the whole meat. And you usually see that on like a Salisbury steak or a cube steak. Okay, you'll find that the texture is very much like a tough hamburger. Okay, it's very, very similar. It's a similar meat cut to a hamburger, what's used in hamburger, and they're just taking a typical cut is like top round or beef bottom round, and then they'll tenderize it using the serrated blades, okay, which they call cube steak. Now this is very sharp, so I don't want to stab myself, so what I do is I usually just hold it down and then literally go at it. Now there's another method, which is the European method, and what they do is they take plastic, which I guess I use this. They take like a plastic wrap and they cover it, and they literally pound the meat, and they actually flatten out the meat. And you see this in schnitzel, pork cutlet, where they take the meat, and as you can see, the meat's spreading out because the meat fibers are breaking. So I'm literally macerating the meat, making it flat. And you can make this, you can pound this where it's completely flat. It's like the size of a plate, okay? And you know it's going to be tender, okay? I prefer, a lot of times when you do that, the shape of the meat changes. Like, as you can see, this is all oddball shape, and there's all kinds of dimples in here. Commonly when they do this, they usually bread it, like a real heavy breading, like fried chicken or something breading, and it's called schnitzel in Germany. Okay, so you could also pound this very, very flat between plastic, and then use it to wrap, say, if you pounded out chicken, and you use it to wrap, say, some cheese and some ham in it, and then you have your cordon bleu. Okay, so that the purpose of that is to tenderize the meat. I prefer the sharpened fork method, or if you have the metal tenderizer, you can do that too. Okay, what this does is when it cooks, it allows the heat to go through the meat, so it's going to cook a lot faster. Also, any seasonings on side, you can put your seasonings on it, and then you can go ahead and season your steak, and that way your seasoning gets straight into it, and then you tenderize the steak that way. So this is a mechanical process, okay? So you're breaking up the meat fibers, or even macerating it to flatten and breaking up the fibers. Okay. Okay. Now there's another method, and I know you're familiar with this, where you use some kind of chemical tenderizer. But the problem with powdered tenderizers, where you put it on the steak and you let it sit, is that it changes the flavor. It changes the texture and the flavor. Sometimes if you overdo the tenderizer, it gets all mushy. So I usually avoid the shaker type tenderizer. Now there is an old school, a really old school. It's on YouTube, and I came across it on YouTube, and it's kind of an interesting one where they use rock salt and they literally cover the meat both sides, and it sucks out all the juices out of the meat, but for some reason the salt kind of like pre-cooks it and it breaks up the fibers. So according to the YouTubers, they say that it's more tender, but I really think that's subjective. I really think that the salt just adds more flavor, and of course the steak's going to be more flavorful, you know, but you can't remove the salt once you put it on. Okay. So there's that part where it's too salty. Okay, now you can throw it back in water, but then you defeat the purpose, because then all the blood comes out, the flavor comes out. So there's give and take. You can research that on your own. Okay. There are other methods of tenderizing meat, and I'm going to touch a little bit on this. One of the methods is cooking it under low heat for a long time. And what that does is it literally, instead of smashing the meat and breaking up the meat fibers that way, by cooking it a long time, you basically denature the meat, and what happens is the fibers eventually, it takes a while, but it eventually breaks down and it tenderizes the meat that way. Your shredded beef, your pulled beef or pulled pork, your Kahlua pig, that's all slow cooked, long time, like 12 to 20 hours. There's another way to speed it up, where you put it in a pressure cooker, and the heat, because of the way the pressure cooker works, you can add more heat to the meat, and it breaks it down faster. That's why when you eat a meat that's been in a can, that's one of the reasons why you find that the meat kind of falls apart and it's like almost granular, is because the cooking process in canning the meat is a long process. They want to make sure they kill all the microbes in it, and so when they do that, the can actually cooks for a long time. But in addition to that, it also stays in that can until you open it, so it could be months, you know, before you open the can. And so while it's sitting in there, the meat is slowly disintegrating in the juices. So even though you're not applying any heat to it, it is disintegrating as it just sits in the cupboard. That's why canned or potted meat not only tastes different than fresh meat, it also has a different texture than fresh meat. That's why your Didi Moore stew, the stew meat in a lot of the canned stews is different from when you actually cut up the meat and cook it yourself and then eat it right away. So the process of sitting in a can for such a long time will break down the fibers in the meat. Okay, so that's another process. You're familiar with it because I do a lot of pot roast that way, and it's a slow cook on low heat simmer for long periods of time. Even in a rice pot, it's very low heat, simmered for like 12 hours, if not, you know, all your whole work day, and then you come home and it's all ready to eat. Okay, and you notice the meat is all tender, it falls apart. Okay, that's because of long cooking times. Okay, so that's another way to tenderize a piece of tough meat. Okay, so you have in in summary, you have the Chinese method, sliced thin across the grain. If you want it a little tougher, you slice it with the grain. You add a little bit of baking powder and your favorite sauce, and you mix it up. You let it sit for at least 15 minutes, and then you stir fry it high heat. Take it off. You don't overcook it. Another way is the mechanical, either through blades or using a mallet or a back end of a knife, heavy knife, or a meat mallet. Okay, so that's macerating the meat physically. And another method is slow cooking, where you use you bring it to a boil, you let it simmer, and you let it sit for at least 3 hours. At least 3 hours. Typically, it's your whole work day, and then you come home like in a crock pot, and it's ready to eat. Okay, so that's some of the methods are fast, like in Chinese cooking. Other methods are a little bit more troublesome, but it gives good results. And then, of course, if you're on the go, you're always working, the slow cook method works real well with a rice pot or a crock pot or any kind of slow cooker, or even in the oven, but you don't really want to leave your oven on. But if you have a constant source of heat, in the old days, they used to put it, next to something that's always hot, right? So you can do that. Okay. And then, of course, something even faster would be a pressure cooker. If you have any questions, email me ootboy2.yahoo@yahoo.com, and I'll see if I can answer you.